Our first speaker is Maria Rewakowicz. She teaches Ukrainian literature at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, and is also affiliated with the Department of Slavic Languages at the University of Washington. She is the author of the monographs Ukraine's Quest for Identity, Embracing Cultural Hybridity and Literary Imagination, published in 2018, Literature, Exile, Alterity, the New York Group of American Poets, and she's co-editor of Contemporary Ukraine on the Cultural Map of Europe. In addition, she has compiled 2 anthologies of the New York Group poetry, all 3 published in Ukraine. And she's the author of 4 books of poetry herself. The title of her talk this afternoon, is War and Writing, Poetic Responses to the Russo-Ukrainian War in the Donbas. I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, Ross and Ron, sorry. And thank you to the Herman Institute and Mark Andrzejczyk for organizing this conference, and I'm really happy to be here. So my topic is War and Writing, Poetic Responses to the Russo-Ukrainian War in the Donbas, and there's nothing new about the connection between war and writing. Seemingly and perhaps regrettably, it is such an inextricable part of our civilization. From Homer's Iliad to Eric Maria's remark, all quiet on the Western Front about World War I, to many, many more accounts about recent wars. So there's something about wars that stirs writers' imagination. But as the literary scholar Samuel Hines rightly asserts, and he himself was a pilot during World War I, he says, quote, "We can never entirely imagine what it's like to actually fight a war. All war is unimaginable, especially for those who never fought or witnessed it," end of quote. Yet, we are all unable to turn away from it. We all want to know what war is like, and we are eager to hear out those who have experienced actual combat or witnessed warfare. As I argued in my book, Ukraine's Quest for Identity, the revolution of dignity in which so many ordinary citizens participated, with a number of them paying the ultimate price, has left a perceivable imprint on the new literature since 2014. The ongoing war in the east of Ukraine figures prominently in works of Belletra, as it was already mentioned by Marco. One can easily argue that qualitatively it is a different kind of literature, a literary output with a different kind of aesthetic sensibility. To test this proposition, I want to focus today specifically on poetic responses to the Russo-Ukrainian conflict in Donbas, as evidenced by 2 recent poetic anthologies, Letters from Ukraine, Poetry Anthology, and Words for War, New Poems from Ukraine. You can see this anthology at the end of this table, and I understand that if someone is interested, you can purchase it. They were published in 2016 and 2017, respectively. Although I will primarily concentrate on Words for War. The anthology Letters from Ukraine is considerably more voluminous. It includes 56 Ukrainian poets expressing themselves either in Ukrainian or Russian, and is rendered into English by 23 translators. It is a bilingual anthology, and it is published for a specific event, if you will. For that, it was part of Lviv Month in Wrocław, European Capital of Culture, in 2016. And as you can see, there are some well-known literary authors and scholars that participated in this project. Mainly, the foreword was written by Yuri Andruchovich. English language editor. It's present here, Vitaly Chernetsky, and Yuri Izdrik, another well-known writer, and was compiled by Grigory Semenchuk. The other anthology, Words for War, was published by Academic Studies Press and edited by Oksana Maximchuk, present here, and Max Rosochensky. It also had introduction by Ilya Kaminsky, who recently was shortlisted, if I'm not mistaken, for the National Book Prize in Poetry, and with an afterword by Polina Barskova. It's a monolingual anthology, only in English, only translations are presented. And as you can see, participating poets, only 16. And it's evenly divided between men and women, 8 female poets and 8 male poets. And with 29 participating translators, so you can see that it's almost like double the number of poets. 14 poets are present in both anthologies, so it means that Letters from Ukraine has like 42 more poets than Words for War. There are 2 poets that participated, that are included in this anthology, Words for War, but are not present in the Letters from Ukraine, and this is Oksana Lutsishina and Mariana Savka. My overall impression from reading Letters from Ukraine is that for its compiler, Grigory Semenchuk, a sheer number of poets included constituted a statement of sorts, and it clearly underscored the urgency and importance of the theme of war among Ukrainian contemporary poets. But the anthology also appears to be compiled somewhat in a hurry. Not all translations seem to be rendered equally convincing. Words for War, on the other hand, is extremely collaborative. Just the number of translators participating indicates that. And also deliberate in its approach. Each poet, I would argue, each line was treated with utmost care. So in full disclosure, I wrote a review essay on this particular anthology, and also about Mark Andrejczyk's anthology. So I allow myself to provide you with a few quotes from that review. And what I would like to emphasize, just like two things. The first one is that I argue that the editors managed to transcend the specificity of the conflict. The poetry included clearly speaks in a universal language, and I also argue that it has all the potential to inscribe itself in the global canon of war poetry. So that's one thing, and it's kind of the second paragraph. And the second thing is that the poems chosen, I think, are not about winning or losing or taking one side against the other, but it's about suffering. It's about the painful consequences of military interventions on civilian populations. So, as you can see from these quotes, I had quite a few words of praise for this anthology. And working on that essay, I was compelled to think what it is that prompts poets to record their painful experiences, feelings, observations, or imaginations about war, as not everyone included in the anthology actually witnessed the battlefield of combat. And here again, I would like to reference Samuel Hines' book of essays on war and writing that was published last year, in which he says, and here's the quotation, "There seems to be 2 quite different needs that produce war writing, the need to report and the need to remember." So, and when I read the anthology for the first time, I came to the conclusion that that need to report it dominates. And I explained this to myself that it's possible because the war in eastern Ukraine was still ongoing and the pain is still fresh, and poets feel compelled to poetically record what they have witnessed. However, as I read it more and more, I realized that the need to remember is, if not equally expressed, it's also quite present. For the remaining of the presentation, I just want to present you illustrations from that anthology, Words for War, how poets capture war and experiences about war, like according to that grid, if you will, the need to report, the need to remember. And there were some poems that could not kind of fit into those two needs, and I had to come up with another need. And it was not so easy to come up the right word for it, but finally I settled on the need to understand, or the need to comprehend, or the need to contemplate what war is all about. So I kind of divided the poets present in the anthology into like kind of three groups. And the first one would include actually the most poets, this need to report. And in that group, I don't have a slide for it, but it's like Anastasia Afanasieva, Borys Humenyuk, Alexandr Kabanov, Kateryna Kalitko, Halina Kruk, Ostap Slevinsky, Luba Yakimchuk, and Serhiy Zhadan. In the group that has poems that to express that need to remember, I included Vasyl Holoborodko, Borys Humenyuk, Mariana Savka, Ostap Slevinsky, and Serhiy Zhadan. There are some poets that are in both columns. Both they have this need to report and the need to remember. And finally, the third group of poets that they kind of express that need to understand or contemplate or comprehend what this war is all about is Yuri Izdryk, Ludmila Hersońska, Borys Hersoński, Mariana Kijanowska, Oksana Lucyshina, and Vasyl Machno. So the first example comes from Anastasia Afanasieva. She's a Russophone poet, and I believe that like her poetry is the one that like really gives voice to all people who are displaced, to those who actually experience firsthand what it means to undergo this military aggression in the Donbas. And she listens and relates the stories of refugees. And here I have another quote that it's not here. On our way to the market, the bullets whistle over our heads. We arrived here with a single bag. There wasn't enough room for people, let alone things, end of quote. So, as I said, she gives voice to the displaced by war people or to those who have no way to evacuate and must suffer under constant bombardment. And I think this poem excerpt that is that you see on the screen is one of those. Our basement doesn't work. It won't protect us. It collapsed on us. It's worse than sitting outside. We dragged our mattresses and pillows onto the floor so that we could fall down as soon as it all starts. We fell down and lay there. Another poet who also kind of expresses this need to report what's happening and who comes from that region, Luba Yakimchuk, and the excerpt that I pick, it kind of paints a painful scene of rape, which we all know it's so widespread in military zones. But she does this in kind of with a distant objectivity. It's just like really to report what happened. Two men approach, order her to open her hands as if to clap. They peer into her passport, passed between themselves, they pressed and squeezed her thumbs. They stripped her, they probed her, they lay her down as a quay. 9 of them, her favorite number, rape her, wearing blue bathrobes, her favorite color. And Borys Humenyuk, the only poet-soldier in the anthology, reports from the battlefield describing gruesome details of seagulls preying on the flesh of the dead. But that's the excerpt here that I included. It's uncanny to see a human finger or an ear fall before you from the sky. Sometimes I think that if you collect all the pieces, you might be able to put together a person, friend or enemy. If only we could find someone to bring him to life. But he also tests the need to remember, quote, to remember us, eat the grain from the field where we laid down our lives. Ostap Slivinsky is another poet who both reports and remembers. And in the poem Alina, that you see this excerpt from, he writes about a woman who reimagines things as they were before through a dance movement. She danced since evenings were still warm and the world was being rolled up like a carpet after a city festival. And lights sparkled above red leaves. She danced because she wanted to turn back, and she knew you couldn't resurrect things by imagining them. She danced because it's better to remember with the body how she woke up, fell asleep on the wet deck, waited for things to be loaded. In turn, display 73-year-old Vasyl Holoborodko knows that there is no return for him to his home in the Luhansk Oblast. Yet he says, as if encouraging himself, quote, you could come back in your thoughts as well. That is, you can dwell in your remembrances of your lost home. But the poet who captures the most of both needs is Serhiy Zhadan. I'm sure that you know him well. By writing about countless individuals marginalized by war, whether it is Sasha, Anton, Andrei, Pavlo, or the nameless, the poet makes sure that they will not be forgotten. For example, in the poem, 3 years now we've been talking about the war, Zhadan writes about one of his acquaintances and what happened to him after he volunteered. Quote, he was normal enough before he left, maybe talked a bit too much about everything on earth, about every little thing he saw in front of him. But when he returned, he was totally different, as if someone had ripped out his old tongue and forgot to replace it. So it is incredible how closely aligned this is with what Heinz has to say about it. Quote, war does change you, sends you home at the end, not just an older person, but a different one from the kid you were when you went. Those of you who are veterans know that. Their values change, their attitudes toward war change, even their vocabularies change, end of quote. So, and here are 2 other examples that I picked from Serhiy Zhadan. So the one is about to remember things and the other one is to report. So now we remember janitors and the night sellers of bread, gray like wrapping paper, burglars, taxi drivers with klaxons instead of hearts, children who grew up among the old furniture smelled of poplar trees and sea. And the other one, short, village street, gas lines broken, accident site, danger. Emergency crew isn't coming, no one wants to be out during shootings. So, and finally, that third need that I added that Heinz does not talk about is that need that I said to understand or to contemplate on the meaning and or meaninglessness of war. So here I included 6 poets, as I said, but I picked examples just from 4 of them. And the first 2 are husband and wife from Odessa, Ludmila Hersonska and Borys Humenyuk. And both display the desire to understand how war affects people or warfare, and both, I would argue, write with a considerable dose of irony. So here comes Ludmila Hersonska. When a country of overall nice people turns slowly fascist, nice people do not notice this transformation all at once. Nice people not when they run into each other and try more and more to lower their eyes until finally raising them becomes an inhuman gesture. And Borys Humenyuk. Modern warfare is too large for the streets, a problem solved by a 1,000-pound bomb. Its contemporary weight equivalent is 16 tons, as they sang in the 50s. Goodbye, pretty girls. Goodbye, company store. We're peaceful people, our armored train stuffed with the spoils of war. And 2 other poets that I included here, Oksana Lutsishin and Vasyl Makhno, both live in the US, and the war in Ukraine, about which they cannot be indifferent, after all, it's happening in their place of origin, but seem far away and somewhat abstract, but both feel compelled to write about it. And Lutsishina seemingly wants to hide in America from all that mess back in Eastern Europe, but clearly in vain. And Makhno, on the other hand, acknowledges certain guilt that he's not there in person, yet admits that no matter where you live, you are always part of your unit, your country, and its troubles. Eastern Europe is a pit of death and decaying plums. I hide from it in the body of America. But sooner or later I'll slip from this light back down into that other. And I will start talking about death, because that is our national sport, talking about death. Sad yet beautiful, hoping that the world will hear us and gasp at the beauty and sadness. And Vasyl Makhno. Each generation must fight its own war. Each in that generation bears his own guilt. You may live in New York, but you are always a soldier of your unit, your country, its troubles. So I would like to conclude by stating that the poetic responses represented both by letters from Ukraine and words for war, implicitly reflect on the identity of today's Ukraine and manifest its cultural hybridity. And the latter is not only about a shifting linguistic reality, but also about different worldviews. The conflict in the east of Ukraine actually impacted some writers' choice of language. For example, the Russophone poet Borys Humenyuk switched to teaching in Ukrainian at Odessa National University as an act of solidarity with occupied Ukraine, a fact related by his friend Ilya Kaminsky in the introduction to Words for War. Another Russophone author from Donetsk, now residing in Kiev, included in the first anthology, Letters from Ukraine, Volodymyr Rafeyenko, that actually Marko mentioned, so now expresses himself artistically in Ukrainian, and his most recent novel was published in that language. Words for War exudes the spirit of collaboration and embraces both Ukrainian and Russophone poets, successfully attempting to bridge seemingly unbridgeable cultural, social, and political fault lines that words invariably create. Polina Barskova, in her afterword, captures the spirit, quote, as the emergence of new poetics, triggered by the revolution of dignity, and still being reinforced by the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war. She also argues, quote, that Ukrainian literary identity is being shaped today within the realm of poetic expression. While some might argue that maybe it's an exaggeration, but I hope that the sheer number of poetic responses presented here supports her claim. Thank you.